Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. I'm going to go a bit modern for this week's monster. Every now and then, a horror film comes along that does more than just good business at the box office. And if we're being honest, horror films are among the biggest profit margin genres in the industry. But when one succeeds with the majority of critics and audience, it starts to become a little bit more special. It can even land the director of that movie with a fairly big project for Marvel Studios. So this week, I'm going to discuss Scott Derrickson's 2012 Spookfest Sinister. Now, most of the films for the last 14 or 15 years that have been significant successes, or at least movies that have become cult favorites out of the gate, come from Blumhouse Productions and founder Jason Blum. We'll talk a little bit more about that company next week as we talk the movie that really kind of launched Blumhouse into prominence back in 2009. But Jason Blum is kind of a genius when it comes to all the different types of horror films that he produces. The films Blumhouse makes are basically makes all of their profit margins on specific franchises. That's your Halloween movies, your Insidious films, and so on, including what I expect to be a Megan series forthcoming. Sinister is one of those movies that turned a couple of profits with this movie and its sequel. And again, much more on Blumhouse next week. But let's talk about Scott Derrickson. Derrickson is a monster kid. He shot out of a cannon in 2000 with 2 sequel horror films as the writer on Urban Legend's Final Cut and the director on Hellraiser Inferno. Now, Jason Oliver and I, back in October 2018, we talked about Hellraiser Inferno when we did all the Hellraiser movies during that month of October. Now, Inferno was one that we actually dug a lot more than many others do, but I digress. Derrickson's had a few other movies that weren't horror, like a story credit on Land of Plenty in 2004 and a writer credit for Devil's Knot, or as director of the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still. But he hit pay dirt in 2005 with the extremely high-grossing The Exorcism of Emily Rose. That one was made on a $19 million budget and grossed over $145 million worldwide. That got him that remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still and Sinister. And Sinister's success, along with that Exorcism flick, led him to be the director of Marvel's Doctor Strange in 2016. And he was in line to direct the sequel that came out last year, but he departed after some creative differences, but still retained an executive producer credit on that sequel. Now, this past year, he was a triple threat writer, producer, director on one of my favorite horror films of 2022, The Black Phone. Now, not all of Derrickson's films are both critical and box office successes, but pretty much all of them are movies that your average moviegoers like to see. And that's one of the things about horror that I feel sometimes gives the genre a sort of a bad name with higher-minded arty-farty folks. I admit I don't love modern-day horror that relies specifically on cheap jump scares. I prefer those things to be earned with atmosphere and a sense of dread in the script and direction. But that said, I really cannot deny the fact that it's fun to get a little jump, even if it's cheap. Why do people like going to haunted houses in October? Well, to get someone to jump out from behind a fake wall or around the corner and go ooga booga at you. Sure, sometimes going to a movie theater on opening weekend with a bunch of younger people in the crowd and have them, jump at everything, be loud, and etc. Sometimes that's not very fun. But that said, sometimes seeing a slasher movie or a paranormal movie with a bunch of people around helps kind of build that intensity. Some of my favorite movie-going experiences were with a loaded auditorium in a movie that was, and this is key, made for general audiences. 24 years ago, seeing The Blair Witch Project in a crowded theater in a city that I was only visiting at a time that was almost 1,000 miles away from home is one of those great movie-going experiences in my life. I think I talked about that in the episode where I covered that for Monster Mondays. But And then there's, of course, seeing things like Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame with a sold-out auditorium. Those are great movie-going general audience experiences. Now, critics can be jerks about those quote-unquote popcorn type of movies or atmospheres, but damn it, sometimes that's the magic of going to the movies. And this is what Scott Derrickson excels in with his movies, particularly his horror films. This will be my first time actually watching Sinister. I mean, I know people who like this movie. I even know sticklers for the same things I am about jump scares and stuff, even like it, despite the movie utilizing some of those cliches, particularly towards the end and what have you. But before we get to that, let's shift gears for a moment. The star of this movie is Ethan Hawke. Now, Hawke got started in movies in 1985 with a role in Joe Dante's Explorers, but it would be 1989's Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams where he probably got his first real breakout role. Then, rolling into the 90s, he started making a lot of Gen X style, sort of rom-com, sort of coming-of-age type of movies, like Reality Bites with Ben Stiller and Winona Ryder. But in 1995, he paired with director Richard Linklater and co-star Julie Delpy for Before Sunrise. And this was the start of a deeply beloved trilogy of romantic dramas about two young lovers meeting on a train in Europe and basically spending the night of their lives together in Vienna. But from there, Hawke transitioned into more challenging and interesting roles. One was in 2001's Training Day that got him nominated for his first Oscar, opposite Denzel Washington as a couple of hard-boiled cops in a gang-infested part of the city. He was nominated for Best Supporting Actor in that. He continued to work with Linklater on the rest of the Before trilogy, Before Sunset and Before Midnight, both of which got him Oscar nominations for co-writing the adapted screenplay. Then, again, he was nominated for an acting performance for Boyhood, also directed by Linklater, again for Best Supporting Actor. Hawke then met up with Scott Derrickson as the incredibly creepy kidnapper and murderer in their second film together, The Black Phone. And Ethan Hawke is a really interesting actor who did a great job kind of escaping his Gen X sort of pretty boy type of potential typecasting. He was really good in the 90s sci-fi movie Gattaca, too. That's another one that I definitely recommend as well. But let's get into Sinister and see what if this movie is worth all the hubbub it's always gotten. The movie opens with grisly 8mm film footage of a family of four being hanged in a tree. And what's particularly peculiar about this film is that it's clear something is operating the contraption that is ultimately hanging the four family members all at once. But we don't really see what it is. It kind of leads to a larger mystery. But then we meet Ellison Oswalt, who's played by Hawke, a true crime author who is moving to a house in a small Pennsylvania town. Ellison's 7-year-old daughter, Ashley, is unhappy about the move to this town. And Ellison's decision to move here is based around the subject of his next book, being, a murder that took place in this town. But his daughter misses her friends and her original school. And it's tough for kids to be kind of taken out like that, especially on decisions that are made by their parents where they don't really have any say-so. But Ellison is kind of contentious about his insistence on uprooting his family for his profession. And on top of that, he has a chat on the first day with the sheriff of the town, who's played by Fred Thompson, playing a very Fred Thompson-esque character, this sheriff really kind of quite dislikes Ellison's writing. The sheriff thinks that Ellison makes things worse for the victims' families, and he also thinks that Ellison moving into the actual house of the victims of the Stevenson family, the family we saw in the old film being hanged, is quite tasteless. He also thinks that Ellison really kind of goes hard against cops when he doesn't really need to. There's kind of an interesting conversation around that with true crime investigators and authors and podcasters and stuff like that. But it's kind of brought up here, and it's kind of played with a little bit later in the movie. But this is kind of important to understand that Ellison is very very much a flawed character as far as how he approaches his writing. But Ellison's real subject of this book is the missing 10-year-old Stephanie Stevenson, who went missing after the rest of her family were murdered. And Ellison is a bit desperate. He had a huge hit with a book about a murder in Kentucky. However, his follow-up books were not as successful and were, we get the impression, a little bit more sensationalized, and it was very possible he made mistakes in his research and claimed the police were to blame for things or making their own mistakes and so forth. And that's really kind of what the sheriff was not too pleased about Ellison coming to this town. Now, while moving some stuff up to the attic, Ellison discovers a box of old 8mm family films that one of which definitely belonged to the Stevensons, but others were from different time periods. It has things labeled in it like Hanging Out with the Family or Pool Party 66 or, some other things like that are very oddly titled, and they don't seem to connect to one another. And it's also a box that should not have been found at all because the crime scene photos that Ellison has shows a completely empty attic. So his curiosity starts to get the better of him, and he decides to give the films a watch. And he's stunned to find the film of a normal day with the Stevensons ending with the footage of the hanging. What's more curious is that it's unclear who made the film or why. Each film, like I said, has titles and subject matter of different killings. The Stevensons had a title that had to do with hanging out with the family. Another is labeled, like I said, Pool Party, and it features the mass drowning of a family and so on. All the films are shot from a distance by an unseen cameraman, and all end with gruesome footage of a killing. The films disturb Ellison, and he intends to call the police, but his hubris kind of gets the better of him, and he decides to basically take this on himself to try to solve the mysteries of these films. And, of course, as soon as he resolves to solve this mystery, he starts hearing unexplained creepy noises in his house. This is broken up by his 12-year-old son having a night terror. The next day, that son, Trevor, is sent home from school for drawing a picture of the Stevenson family hanging from a tree on the wall of his classroom. In the film that features the drownings, Ellison discovers another disturbing sight, what appears to be a man wearing white and black makeup on his face. One after another, Ellison watches the films and finds that guy appearing in them somewhere. And there's a mysterious rune that's been scribbled someplace, usually on the wall or someplace in the film footage as well. In addition, all the murders are of a family, and all the families have one missing child in the aftermath of these murders. More sounds in the attic lure Ellison upstairs, where he finds a snake under a box, but also a few doodles on the wall that gives him the names of the people in the various films, but also another figure represented in these doodles named Mr. Bughuul. As more information is uncovered about the murders, Ellison starts to connect that the Stevensons lived at a house where a previous murder took place. And what's more, still images of Mr. Bughuul starts to move. And there's footage of Ellison in his attic that also has ghostly hands of children tugging at him. Oh, and the 8mm projector starts to run on its own in the middle of the night. And Trevor's night terrors are only getting worse. And Ellison is seeing Mr. Bughuul in his backyard. And a Rottweiler that I have no other description for but a devil dog. And we see ghostly apparitions of the missing kids from the previous families. So Tracy knows, Tracy's his wife, she knows that something bad is going on. And Ellison's acting bad. He's drinking a lot more. Trevor's night terrors are getting worse, something that he hasn't had for years. But a deputy starts to assist Ellison by getting him info about the other murders that he has these films of. That helps us see more of the ultimate connection between the murders. All the murders are ritualistic. The guy committing the murders uses different methods: drowning, fire, hanging, slit throats, and one that deals with the lawnmower that I'll talk about a little bit later. But there's an occult symbol left behind in every location, and one family member is spared and seemingly taken with the killer. 1966 is the earliest date that Ellison knows about, and the deputy is suspect that the killer would now, at best, be in his 70s. So how could it really be completely and totally connected? But a college professor that the deputy knows connects with Ellison and tells him of a pagan deity from way back that's called Bughuul. Now, Bughuul is nicknamed the Eater of Children, and he basically seduces children to be his friend. The killings are sacrificial, and he takes the children he's befriended to a netherworld where he ultimately consumes their souls. The sacrifices could be anything from blood sacrifice to actually eating children. These murders are all basically fitting the bill of being related to this obscure deity and those sacrifices. One night, Ellison is being unknowingly chased around his house by the missing kids of Bughuul's murders. Meanwhile, his little girl Ashley begins talking to Stephanie Stevenson, the missing girl from the last of the murders. Ashley paints a picture of Stephanie on the wall in the hallway and reveals it's the girl that Daddy is writing his book about. And she doesn't want the picture in Ashley's room because that was her brother's room and not hers. But that night, Ellison is woken up again by the sound of the projector. But when he goes to his office, the projector isn't there. It's been taken back to the attic where he sees the missing children all watching a film that features Bughuul, who comes out of the film to startle Ellison to make him fall down the ladder into the hallway. And then soon the projector and the films are tossed down the attic opening into the hallway. Finally, spooked beyond pretty much everything, Ellison attempts to burn all the films in the fire pit outside. And he tells his wife Tracy, in kind of a move that is unusual in the horror films of the last 15 years or so, that they need to get out of there. He's not sticking around anymore. He's not going to finish his book. They got to leave now. And they need to get away from this place so that they're not bothered by this Bughuul character anymore. Now, on their way out of town, they get pulled over by the sheriff. And he does ask, you're not being forced out of town or bullied out of town because of the subject of the book. Because, more than anything, he wants to protect he wants to kind of protect the reputation of this town that had this terrible thing happen a few years ago. But again, Ellison says there's not going to be a book, and he decides to take his family back to their previous house where he will just settle for working a job that he kind of doesn't want to, with editing and writing school books and stuff like that. But however, upon moving back to their old house, Ellison finds the box of films again with a note and a few smaller pieces of film stating that they are extended cut endings. Suddenly drawn back to them again, Ellison pieces the films together, and he finds out from the deputy in the other town that he was getting the info from that every single family that was killed lived in the house of the previous murder. Having moved out of the Stevensons' home, he's now wrapped up in the same pattern. And the extended endings he got from the box of films show that all the missing kids after the murder showing themselves to the camera and disappearing. They were the ones who committed all the murders. He soon passes out from something being put into his coffee, and he's bound and gagged. His daughter Ashley was influenced by the ghost of Stephanie to fall under Bughuul's influence, and she films herself axing the family to death and painting the walls with their blood. The film now becomes part of the collection of films and named House Painting 2012. Bughuul picks up Ashley, and they disappear into the film that she made. So it was not. So there's a couple of pretty good red herrings in this. We think that maybe Ellison is being influenced. We think that it's Trevor because of his night terrors and that he's doing peculiar things. It turns out that Trevor's night terrors were not at all caused by Bughuul, and that it's actually Ashley who has kind of devolved into being this murderer and a acolyte of Bughuul. It's a pretty good little movie. I really did enjoy this movie, and that means it's time to get to my 3 things that I liked about Sinister. First of all, Ethan Hawke is really good in this. You see this guy who is devolving into his worst instincts as a writer who is seeking to recapture fame. He's kind of a jerk at the beginning with the whole uprooting of his family for his ambitions. But we see very quickly that he's a drinker. And it all gets worse as he dives deeper into this mystery of these connected killings. He becomes jumpy. He starts smoking. He's bothered by sounds and the projector running on its own. You know, he's being watched and followed and messed with by the specters of Bughuul's eaten children's souls and so forth. It's a really good performance from Hawke that is kind of subtle, how he is bothered more and more by seeing the murders that he's uncovered actually playing out in films. And that leads directly into my second thing that I'll note as a like on this movie. Here's a guy whose career is based on writing true crime novels. He sees and hears the gory details of these terrible crimes over and over again as he's writing it. He's recounting them himself. It's his job to be a witness to things that few people will ever see or want to see. And that is, like police reports, crime scene photos, and so forth. Yet we see him unravel immediately upon actually viewing the films. It makes perfect sense that even people who get into these kinds of subjects and do books or podcasts and so forth, well, they're not really seeing the crimes being committed. Again, they're seeing pictures, they're reading police reports, they're watching interviews and so forth. Actually seeing the crimes committed is a whole different thing. It takes out any other influence or story or imagination that's put into by those interviews or those reports or those pictures. It's a dark thing to get interested in, and a lot of people do. That's why Dateline, NBC, and 2020 have been around for ages. However, there's a layer that we're removed from. That's the actual crimes themselves. So listening to the stories about someone being killed is dark, but we kind of start to, kind of tie in our natural curiosity and, again, tying our imagination to these stories and starting to feel for these people regardless of what they actually were in real life. We kind of start tying that in to what we think is the right thing to do to tell their story. But actually seeing the killing is something very, very few people could really handle. I really like that it becomes part of the declining character traits of our lead instead of him just continuing to be driven by his desire to have a successful book again and kind of shutting his feelings off. Now, thirdly, I like that this movie takes its time before getting to the real scares. The first half of the movie is more of a thriller and a mystery that we're seeing with Ellison learning more and more about these various murders. We're piecing the puzzle together. It takes a while before we see Bughuul in the films. Then, at the halfway point, the horror movie really kicks in. Ghostly children, films he shouldn't have, projectors showing him more and more. It's kind of perfectly set up by a really great and earned jump scare. There's a film that we hadn't seen any of previously where someone is watching a family through a window from outside. Then we see that watcher start up a lawnmower and pushing it through the yard on a rainy night. Then, suddenly, out of nowhere, there's a person laying in the yard and gets their face run over by the lawnmower. It's just a split second, but Ethan Hawke's reaction to that is just great. I mean, it is like he's actually watching it for real. And then it launches into the horror of the movie. From there, again, it's a real horror movie that has ghosts and monsters, and it's just great. And you know there is no getting away from this cursed box of films of murders and ghostly dead kids. What makes the horror work really well for me isn't so much that we wait for half the movie to get the scares or the creepy dead kids or any of that normal horror stuff. It's not even really our monster Bughuul. He's kind of unremarkable as a creature. It's that the movie lets the 8mm films remain silent. We're being drawn into it. We're just seeing images, Some images are innocuous, like family doing normal family stuff, but some become really scary. But we're not hearing what's going on in the films. And that's a restraint that not a whole lot of horror movies will stick to. It actually kind of reminds me of something that would have been made in the 90s, post-7, where we can be introduced to some pretty ghastly stuff and let the ghastly stuff speak for itself and not have to have anything extra be applied to the movie to really ramp up those scares. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also now find us on Mastodon as well. So we're just kind of getting started there, but feel free to follow us there if you have an account there as well. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, and read new review articles every Friday morning. Next week, we're going to go backwards a few years in the Blumhouse timeline there and talk about the movie that helped catapult Blumhouse into a serious powerhouse horror production company and a hit factory for horror as well. 2009's Paranormal Activity. So until next week, stay spooky.